Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin certainly likes to position himself as an important figure on the world stage and wants to paint Russia as a major geopolitical player. And that's why the Kremlin has confirmed that these talks between President Putin and Kim Jong-un are going to happen before the end of April, very likely to be taking place next week in the Russian city of Vladivostok. And Russia, of course, is hoping to negotiate over denuclearization on the Korean peninsula, but there's also a number of issues that the two countries will be discussing. The two countries, of course, the DPRK and Russia share a short land border in Russia's far eastern region. There are tens of thousands of DPRK laborers working in Russia, sending remittances home that are very important to the DPRK economy. But under UN sanctions, those workers are expected to be sent home by the end of this year. So that's something that the two leaders will be expected to be discussing if those talks go ahead next week. Of course, there are historic Cold War ties between the two countries, and Russia has certainly been softer on the DPRK with regards to sanctions, with regards to condemnation on the UN Security Council. Russia tends to vote with China on those DPRK matters. So there's certainly room for fruitful negotiations between the two countries. Some critics would say that President Putin doesn't quite have the influence to pull any major strings in this regard, but it certainly comes at a time when the US influence seems to be slightly waning with regards to the DPRK. The situation between the two countries, the tensions have been rising slightly over the last few months after the Hanoi summit ended without any major agreements. And today we've been hearing from the DPRK state news agency, who have been reporting that a North Korean official has said that the country wants Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, to be removed from nuclear talks because they have accused him of misrepresenting some of Kim Jong-un's words. And they say that they would like someone with a more careful and mature in communicating. So it's certainly possible that President Putin is hoping to be that mature and careful communicator. He certainly likes to see himself as a statesman on the world stage. And today, of course, the DPRK also announced that they had conducted some missile testing, and that's the first time that's happened since the Hanoi summit. So it certainly looks like the DPRK is trying to make a statement to the U.S. ahead of these potential talks with Vladimir Putin next week. But of course, the U.S. is still involved. They've still got a seat at the table. The U.S. Special Envoy on the DPRK has been here in Moscow over the last few days, holding discussions with Russian Foreign Ministry officials, likely briefing them ahead of what could be this summit that's taking place next week between the Russian and the DPRK leaders. And so the U.S. will certainly still have some influence on what goes on, but I think Russia is hoping that they can produce, that the country can produce some sort of result in these negotiations that will be possibly taking place next week with Kim Jong-un, some kind of result that Donald Trump was unable to procure from those Hanoi talks. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Moscow.